Hi everyone, a quick note before we launch into today's video. Based on the enormous level of interest in our IPSA professional training course, leading to accreditation as a hypnotherapist and psychotherapist, we are now open to accepting applications to train with us all year round, with the next CADA launching in January 2022. If you're interested in studying to become a professional depth psychologist through Steve and Pauline's psychosystems analysis model, then check out the application process through the link in the description. Thanks. The psychosystems analysis model of the structure and dynamics of the psyche, created by Steve and Pauline Richards, has a Jungian core, that being including the self, anima and animus, shadow, and complexes, among other things. All of these concepts have their original conception as discretely described structures in the clinical work of C.G. Jung. However, like with all models, they have all, by necessity, been updated as time has gone on, in line with clinical observations and developments in neuroscience and genetics. In this video, we will focus on the self, including how Jung devised his initial conception of this so-called archetype, and what we currently know it to be for the purposes of personal development, study and interest, or for any clinicians watching to aid in the theory surrounding their current practice. Like Freud and Adler before him, Jung's model was a product of his own personal myth. He himself said this in Memories, Dreams, Reflections. Thus, the modern reader or listener must be forensic when investigating his work to determine what is objective, that is, what presents in oneself and other people empirically, and what is a product of Jung the man. The self was initially conceived as a psychodynamic structure which was simultaneously its own entity whilst containing within it all other components of the psyche as emergent. The self is indeed real in the sense that it can be observed clinically, most prominently in resultant images arising during dreaming. Described as the totality of the psyche, the self is a curious conception, as there is nothing else like it which appears in any previous psychoanalytic tradition or derivation. However, as one reads through the collected works, one will come to see that this so-called archetype is often bestowed with religiose properties. Perhaps the most apt example of this comes from Collected Works 9, Volume 2, that is, Ion. In that text, Christ is described as a symbol of the self, and in turn, all the moral implications of the split between science and religion that, according to Jung, defined the collective self of the so-called Western psyche for the past 2,000 years, flow from this. This particular colouring of this nevertheless very real and clinically demonstrable psychodynamic structure originates from Jung's own personal myth, on which we have a video on this channel, which breaks down precisely what Jung was actually doing by writing Ion in the first place. I would encourage you to watch that if you have an interest in why you or others have an interest in Ion or the mystical aspect of the self in the first place. Thus, we have a concept that can be observed and is real, yet needs to be disentangled from Jung's own personal psyche and his own personal complexes, which he frequently disclosed in his writings, despite often in a covert manner. That is the first step towards an understanding of the self, as otherwise transference, identification and projection will obscure further genuine engagement with this concept. The next step is to fill in the glaring hole which Jung left open, which fantasy often rushes in to fill. That is his lack of emphasis on the biological component to the self. Early on in his career, Jung was a proponent of seeing mind and body as two sides of the same coin. Essentially that the psyche emerges from biology, yet it exists as its own discrete layer, biopsychosocially. Thus, the self too must have an organic component. What then could this be? Well, as mentioned earlier, the self is its own entity, yet the other core structures of the psyche emerge from it. Indeed, the self cannot operate functionally on its own. It endows the ego with a certain amount of executive control for the purposes of adaptation. What then is the biological correlate to these 2 points? It is, and can only be, the genome. This linking step was initially devised by Steve Richards, who regular viewers of the Jung To Live By channel are very familiar with, and whose model, together with his wife, Pauline, was supported by Carl Jung's only son, Franz Jung, in the Jung family home in May of 1992. Let's examine the genome then. The genome is simultaneously its own stable entity, and yet everything biological composing an organism emerges from it. Indeed, like the self, the genome needs the human being who is separate from it, that is, being produced from it, for the purposes of increasing adaptation. When compared side by side, the self and the genome correlate 1-to-1, functionally. Jung, passing away in 1961, did not have the genetics knowledge to make this link himself. The structure of DNA was only discovered in the previous decade, in 1953, by Watson and Crick, and the central dogma of molecular biology was, in its earliest public description, at best only a few years old. Thus, the self should and must be updated in line with these and more recent developments. Hence, the self is better described as the genomic self. To describe the nature and function of this genomic self, I will now narrate a chapter from Discover Your Personal Myth, Ultimate Handbook, written by Steve Richards. Designed as the quintessential distillation of 80 years of combined clinical experience between Steve and Pauline, and the canon of depth psychology as such, for self-development purposes, you can pick up your own copy of this 458 A4 page book from the links in the description. We really hope it's useful to you. The genomic self refers to the biologically grounded substrate of Jung's concept of the self-archetype. Whereas Jung's self-archetype is fundamentally a psychologism, in that the essential truth of human nature either is or can only be explained psychologically, the concept of the genomic self appreciates the fact that the human organism is, in its essence, biological, and that its core is genetic, i.e. the genome. Just as the genome releases and regulates human biological maturation, so too does it release and regulate the psyche out from itself. The psychologism that Jung called the self, as representative of the unknowable totality of the human organism, is therefore better considered the genomic self, and thought of in an experiential sense as the projection into psychology of the image of the totality of the genome, as far as psychology can contain such a projection. This is congruent with what is known in genetics, neuroscience, evolutionary biology, and the wider field of psychology about the nature and development of biology as the logos of life. The genomic self does not contradict Jung's model, so much as contextualize and further refine it, without the theory-laden issues that come with Jung's otherwise highly personal and idiosyncratic approach. The genomic self is the genome, self-organizing and self-regulating across lifespan development. Without it, there can be no Jungian individuation. The genomic self regulates human function as an emergent timed release process across lifespan development. Starting with its innate genetic instructions, it first releases those essential instincts and drives for imprinting and attachment to caregivers that are necessary for survival. The genomic self interacts via these first social relationships, object relations, to develop a somatic or bodily sense of self, forming a concurrent, pre-conscious, socially imprinted identity as a subject, independent to some degree of others or objects. This is the first phase of psychological development out from the matrix of the genome. As consciousness further develops, the ego forms a more definite state of independent identity, the personal self, a reflexive ego, completing the second phase of emergent psychological development. Over time, this becomes ever more socially adapted, and the social self develops, the third emergent phase out from the genome. So timed release, or telic intentionality out from the genome, results in the biopsychosocial self, that which fully emerges from the innate genetic program, to develop a psychological, individual identity within a wider social world. The self, then, exists simultaneously at all three biopsychosocial levels: biological, psychological, and social. The biological genomic self is contiguous with its emergent psychology, and with its social and environmental expression. Humans, in common with all higher animals, are born with various innate representational systems that anticipate environmental and social experience. These range through categories of physical space and the relationship between objects to preparedness to imprint, for example, onto the mother's face. Their release is timed by the genome to match the imperatives of immediate survival and to begin the task of adaptive, flexible learning within the social and natural world. They are, in effect, virtual images, just as Jung suggested were the innate foundation of archetypes. However, Jung's archetypal hypothesis became so elaborated over time that it lost its connection to biology and drifted, along with Jung's personal psychology, into metaphysics. He would deny this, insisting that he was a scientist, but after he abandoned his actual scientific work, which was the psychophysiology of complexes, and gave up frontline healthcare at the Burke-Holsley Hospital to spend the next 50 years working with wealthy neurotics, he became more and more separated from hard science. This was certainly the result of him following his personal myth to the very end of his life. So the genomic self is the true biological substrate for Jung's self-archetype. When the self-archetype appears in consciousness, either through fantasies, active imagination, symbols, or dreams, it is therefore an internal projection of the deeper genomic self out into a representational psychological form within the ego and its associated field of consciousness. The ego is, of course, the personal self, that which we refer to reflexively for our sense of identity and continuity of being. Such internal projections typically acquire an associative meaning and can become reified by the conscious personality, as if they were independent sub-personalities, sometimes taking on the form of gods, demons, fantasy figures, or the symptoms of acute or chronic mental illness. The quote from Jung on screen now is an example. Today, they are called phobias, obsessions, and so forth. In a word, neurotic symptoms. The gods have become diseases. Zeus no longer rules Olympus, but rather the solar plexus, and produces curious specimens for the doctor's consulting room, or disorders of the brains of politicians and journalists who unwillingly let loose psychic epidemics on the world. They are also social and cultural representations of the self, appearing as symbols, narratives, stories, religions, and myths that are either consciously internalized, that is, accepted and identified with by the ego, or unconsciously introjected by the psyche. Known as collective representations, Jung's borrowing of the term from Durkheim and Bruhl, showing that he understood that his theory of archetypes, of which the self was the most important, had a causal social dimension in addition to the biological one. Once internalized, these collective representations interact with Jung's psychological self to create resultant images. These resultant images are then simultaneously representations of the deep structure innate representational system and the collective representations from culture. They correlate closely with what Jung called archetypal images, but are part of a wider network that includes the genomic self, instincts, and complexes, which taken together may be considered as a single system. The Personal Myth Guide recommends here that the reader see the 7 basic emotional systems and the relating system diagrams later on in the document. The innate and cultural factors interact dialectically to produce the resultant images as they appear both within consciousness and as stored in the personal unconscious, that is, memory and learning. The image thus formed will be available to the psyche to illustrate, inform, or regulate complexes. Part of the process on inner work and self-analysis is to understand how far an image is being utilized by a complex autonomously, and therefore for its own purposes. Some internalized images are mistaken by followers of Jung as being archetypes, whereas they are more properly conceived of as collective complexes, or perhaps stereotypes of the collective consciousness. Collective representations can form the basis of internalized or introjected collective myths, and as guiding fictions, as Adler would have called them, producing pseudo-personal myths that distract people into fantasy as a defense mechanism or displacement, avoiding the very real and fundamentally challenging task of actualizing their genomic potential. Thanks for listening, everyone. We really hope that you found this video useful, and indeed, if you did and wish to learn more, then I cannot recommend Discover Your Personal Myth Ultimate Handbook enough. Picking up a copy also doubles as supporting Steve and Pauline's continued psychodynamic work too, allowing us to continue to produce cutting-edge videos like this one. Take care, everyone, and see you soon. Jung To Live By's first merch range is now available, with 260 products to choose from, courtesy of Gareth Richards. Whether that be a biopsychosocial night t-shirt, a Freud Adler Jung phone case, your MBTI type, or, for you guys in the Discord server, kindest regards adorning a mug, there's something for everyone. Check out jungtoliveby.shop and bring just a little bit more depth psychology to your daily life.